Every March, America loses its collective mind. We dye our rivers green. We consume ungodly amounts of corned beef, which, by the way, isn't actually a traditional dish in Dublin. We put on plastic hats with clovers on them. And millions of Americans, from the suburbs of Boston to the hollers of Kentucky, stand up and proudly declare, "I am Irish." According to the United States Census, roughly 35 million Americans claim Irish ancestry. That is a staggering number. To put that in perspective, the entire population of the actual island of Ireland today is only about 5 million people, 7 million if you count the North. That means there are 7 times as many Irish people in America as there are in Ireland. But here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to talk about at the parade. If your family has been in the United States since before the Civil War, if your family settled in the South, the Midwest, or the Appalachian Mountains, and if your family was Protestant, not Catholic, then you probably aren't Irish. At least, not the way you think you are. You're the victim of a 200-year-old case of mistaken identity. You don't belong to the story of the Potato Famine. You don't belong to the story of the tenements of New York or the docks of Boston. You belong to a different story entirely, a story that is darker, bloodier, and much more violent. You aren't Irish. You are Scots-Irish. And today, we are going to find out why you forgot who you are. This matters because your identity isn't just a fun fact for a cocktail party. It is the blueprint of your psychology. If you have ever wondered why the culture of the American South is so obsessed with honor, why the American military is disproportionately staffed by people from rural areas, or why you have a deep, almost genetic suspicion of the government, you won't find the answer in Dublin. You will find it in the borderlands of Scotland in the year 1500. But before we cross the ocean, we have to deal with the confusion right here at home. We have to separate the two tribes. To understand American history, you have to understand that there were 2 completely different waves of migration from that part of the world. And honestly, they didn't like each other very much. Group A is the one everyone knows. These are the Famine Irish. They arrived in the 1840s and 1850s. They were Catholic. They were escaping mass starvation. They were incredibly poor, and when they arrived, they got stuck in the cities. They didn't have the money to move west. They stayed in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They became the police officers, the firefighters, the politicians. This is the Kennedy family. This is the movie The Departed. This is the St. Patrick's Day crowd. Group B is the group most of you actually belong to. These are the Ulster Scots, or what we eventually called the Scots-Irish. They arrived 100 years earlier, in the 1700s. They weren't Catholic. They were fiercely Presbyterian. They didn't stay in the cities. In fact, they hated the cities. They looked at the crowded streets of Philadelphia and said, "Absolutely not." They bought a rifle and a wagon and headed straight for the frontier. They went to Pennsylvania, then down the Great Wagon Road into Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Carolinas. They didn't consider themselves Irish. In fact, back in the old country, they were the ones oppressing the Irish. They were Scotsmen who had been moved to Northern Ireland by the British king to colonize it. They lived in Ireland for a century, but they never became Irish. They kept their Scottish names, they kept their Scottish religion, and they kept their Scottish temper. So if your last name is distinctively Scottish, names like Graham, Armstrong, Bell, Jackson, or Calhoun, but your grandpa always told you he was Irish, he was technically telling the truth geographically, because the boat sailed from Belfast. But he was lying culturally. He wasn't Irish. He was a transplanted Scot. And the difference between those two things explains almost everything about the cultural divide in America today. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of your own family, and you want to make sure you don't miss the next part where we explore the Melungeons and the hidden German ancestry of the Midwest, go ahead and click that subscribe button right now. We are building a tribe of people who care about the truth, not just the myths, and I want you to be part of it. Now, to understand why you are the way you are, we have to go back. We have to leave America. We have to go back before the famine. We have to go back to a place called the Debatable Land. Imagine a strip of land about 40 miles wide running along the border between Scotland and England. Today, it is beautiful, rolling sheep country. But in the year 1500, it was essentially Afghanistan. It was a failed state. For 300 years, England and Scotland were at war. Armies marched back and forth across this border constantly. They burned every farm. They stole every cow. They killed every man of fighting age. If you lived in this region, you learned very quickly that you could not rely on the law, The King of Scotland was too weak to protect you, and the King of England wanted to kill you. So the people of the border stopped being farmers. Farming is pointless if an army is going to burn your crops next week. Instead, they became something else. They became semi-nomadic cattle herders, and more importantly, they became professional thieves. History calls them the border reivers. If you have a surname like Nixon, Elliot, Johnstone, Kerr, Maxwell, or Scott, these are your people. They lived in fortified towers made of stone. They slept with their boots on. They slept with their swords next to the bed. Their entire society was built around the raid. And you would wait for a moonless night, mount your small, fast horses, they called them hobblers, and ride across the border to steal cattle from the English. Then the English would ride back the next night to steal them back. This environment created a very specific psychology. It created a culture that was clannish, violent, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. It created a culture where the only thing that mattered was loyalty to your kin. If someone crossed a member of the Armstrong clan, they didn't call the police. They got on their horses and burned the enemy's house down. This is called retributive justice. And it is the exact same psychology that you see hundreds of years later in the feuds of Appalachia, like the Hatfields and the McCoys. That wasn't an American story. That was a Scottish border story that just happened to take place in West Virginia. But how did they get to Ireland? And why do we call them Scots-Irish? The story takes a dark turn in the year 1603. Queen Elizabeth I of England died, and her cousin, King James of Scotland, inherited the throne. Suddenly, the border disappeared. England and Scotland had the same king. King James looked at the borderlands, at these violent, ungovernable warlords, and decided he needed to break them. He executed the leaders. He deported whole families, and he came up with a plan to solve two problems at once. He had a problem in Ireland. The native Irish Catholics were rebelling against English rule. James needed a way to pacify Ireland. He needed a loyal population he could plant there to control the locals. So he looked at the border reivers. He saw a group of people who were Protestant, who were tough as nails, and who needed a new home. So he made them an offer. Move to Ulster in the north of Ireland. I will give you land. I will let you keep your religion. All you have to do is hold the ground against the Irish. Tens of thousands of them took the deal. They packed up their few belongings and crossed the Irish Sea. They thought they were being given a new start. In reality, they were being sent into a meat grinder. This is the period known as the plantation of Ulster. The Scots arrived in Ireland, but they didn't mix with the locals. They couldn't. The native Irish viewed them as invaders. They were surrounded. They had to live in fortified farms, keeping their muskets primed at all times. This century in Ireland, from roughly 1610 to 1715, acted as a pressure cooker. It took the already hard culture of the border reivers and distilled it into something even harder. It created what historians call a siege mentality. They learned that they were a minority. They learned that the natives wanted to kill them. And they learned that the British government, who had sent them there, didn't actually care about them. Because once the reivers had pacified Ulster, the British elites turned on them. They were jealous of their success. They started passing laws restricting their trade. They raised the rents on the land. They told them they couldn't hold public office unless they converted to the Church of England. The Scots-Irish realized they had been played. They were the buffer, the guard dogs. And when the wolf was gone, the master started kicking the dog. By 1717, the situation was intolerable. Drought destroyed the crops, rents skyrocketed, and a whisper started to move through the Presbyterian churches of Ulster, a whisper about a new land, a land where there were no landlords, a land where there was no king telling you how to pray, a land that was wild and dangerous and free. They called it Pennsylvania. And so the ships began to fill. This was the Great Migration. It wasn't just a few people, it was an exodus. Between 1717 and 1775, more than 200,000 people left Ulster for America. That might not sound like a lot today, but at the time it was a massive percentage of the population. They didn't go to New England. The Puritans in Boston were too rigid. They didn't want these rowdy, violent Scotsmen. They landed in Philadelphia. But the Quakers who ran Pennsylvania were pacifists. They were terrified of these people. The Scots-Irish were loud. They drank whiskey. They shot their guns in the air. They started fights. So the Quakers did exactly what the British king had done 100 years earlier. They said, you can't stay here, but you can have all the land you want if you go west. They pushed the Scots-Irish out to the frontier, into the mountains. They wanted them to be a buffer zone between the civilized cities on the coast and the Native American tribes in the west. Once again, the Scots-Irish were used as a human shield, but this time it backfired on the elites because the Scots-Irish loved the mountains. It looked like the Scottish borders. It looked like home. They settled in the hollows and the valleys. They built log cabins, a design they actually picked up from the Swedes and Germans, but perfected for the American wilderness. They distilled whiskey because it was easier to transport over the mountains than grain, and they fought. They fought the Shawnee and the Cherokee with a brutality that shocked the other colonists. They adopted the fighting style of their Native American enemies. They learned to scalp. They learned to ambush. They became the frontiersmen. This is where the stereotype of the hillbilly comes from. It was originally a term for the supporters of King William, the Billy Boys, who lived in the hills. They were poor, they were uneducated, but they were free, and they hated authority. When the American Revolution started in 1776, the Scots-Irish were the first ones to sign up. For the English settlers on the coast, the war was about taxes and tea. For the Scots-Irish in the mountains, it was about revenge. They had been kicked out of Scotland. They had been abused in Ireland. And now the British king was trying to control them in America. They went to war with a fury that terrified the British army. A British general actually called them the most dangerous enemy in America. He said that if he could defeat the Presbyterians with rifles, he could win the war. But he couldn't defeat them. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, a militia of Scots-Irish frontiersmen, the Over-Mountain Men, destroyed a British loyalist army. Thomas Jefferson called it the turning point of the war. So, if these people were so proud of their Scottish heritage, why do 30 million Americans call themselves Irish today? Why did we drop the Scots part? It happened slowly through a process historians call the Great Forgetting. The first reason was the war itself. After fighting the British Empire, anything that sounded British, including Scotland, became unpopular. They wanted to be Americans, pure and simple. The second reason was simplicity. Scots-Irish is a mouthful. It is a clunky academic term. When a census taker came to a log cabin in Tennessee in 1850 and asked a man where his people came from, he would just say Ireland, because that is where the boat sailed from. He didn't give a history lecture about the plantation of Ulster. He just said Ireland, and over generations the nuance was lost. The grandchildren just knew they came from Ireland. Then came the Civil War. The Scots-Irish provided the bulk of the soldiers for the Confederacy, and a huge number for the Union as well. The war devastated their communities. In the aftermath, the poverty of the South and Appalachia froze their culture in time. While the rest of America industrialized, the Scots-Irish kept their old ways. They kept their dialect. If you listen to a heavy Appalachian accent today, you are hearing the ghosts of 17th century Elizabethan English mixed with the Border Scots dialect. Words like victuals and yonder, the structure of the sentences. It is a time capsule. But the biggest reason for the confusion is the simple power of the Catholic Irish narrative. When the famine ships arrived in the 1840s, the sheer number of Irish Catholics overwhelmed the cities. They had a strong identity. They organized. They built political machines. They defined what Irish meant in the American imagination. The Scots-Irish, meanwhile, were dispersed in the hills. They were independent. They didn't join clubs. They didn't hold parades. They just wanted to be left alone. So the definition of Irish shifted. It became synonymous with Catholic, urban, and Democrat. The Protestant, rural, libertarian strain of the family was forgotten or simply relabeled as redneck. But the culture didn't disappear. It just changed names. We stopped calling it Scots-Irish culture and started calling it country. Bluegrass music? That is just Scottish folk music played at double speed with a banjo added. The square dance? That is Scottish country dancing. The obsession with guns and land rights? That comes straight from the Scottish borderlands. You didn't lose your history. It just became the default setting for American rural life. And this leads to the biggest twist of all, the one that causes so much confusion on Ancestry. Calm. There's a huge overlap between families who think they are Black Dutch or part Cherokee and families who are actually Scots-Irish. Why? Because the Scots-Irish were the ones living right next to the Native American tribes. They traded with them. They fought them. And yes, sometimes they married them. But more often, dark-complexioned Scots-Irish people, sometimes called the Black Irish due to ancient Spanish DNA or just weathering, were mistaken for having native blood. If you have a family legend about a Cherokee princess in your tree, but your DNA test comes back 100% British Isles, look at your map. Did your family live in Appalachia? Do you have a Scottish surname? Congratulations. You aren't Native American, and you aren't Irish. You are the descendant of the frontiersmen who built the country. So, next St. Patrick's Day, when you see the green beer and the plastic leprechauns, you don't have to participate. That isn't your holiday. Your holiday is every day you wake up in a free country that your ancestors carved out of the wilderness with an axe. If you want to know if you're part of this tribe, check your surname. Names starting with Mac or Mac are the obvious giveaway, but look for the border river names. Nixon, Elliot, Johnson, Kerr. If you have these names, you have a legacy that goes back to the medieval warriors of Scotland, not the potato fields of Cork. And honestly, I think that is a much cooler story. If you are listening to this and realizing that everything you were told about your family history was slightly wrong, you are not alone. This is the American story. We are a nation of amnesiacs. We forget where we came from to become who we are. But the DNA doesn't lie. The history is there if you know where to look. We are going to be diving deeper into the specific clans of the borderlands in future episodes. We are going to look at the Armstrongs, a family so violent that the Bishop of Glasgow excommunicated the entire surname. We are going to look at the Grahams, who were deported en masse to the swamps of Ireland. If you have those names in your tree, you have a lot of explaining to do. So make sure you are subscribed. We are reclaiming this history one story at a time. The myth of the Irish American is strong, but the truth of the Scots-Irish is stronger. It is the bedrock of the nation, and it is time we remembered it